Okay, good evening, everyone. And I think we'll get started just with some opening remarks, and there will certainly be lots of opportunities to for anyone who's still joining us to catch up. And as you might have heard when you first logged on, the session is being recorded. So we hope to post these on the website shortly thereafter after the session. So if you have any follow-up questions or would like to review anything, you'll be able to do so. So just to get underway, good evening, everyone, and thanks again for joining us this evening. My name is Matt Rodriguez. I'm a planner at WSP, the consulting firm that is working with the township on this rural zoning bylaw review. This meeting is the first public open house in a series of 3 for the rural zoning bylaw review. And the objective of tonight's meeting is to introduce the project, seek input into the types of issues with the current zoning bylaw framework, and have an initial conversation about this project. Bobby, could you go to the next slide, please? So our agenda for this evening is we'll go over just some brief housekeeping items just to get everyone up to speed on this GoToMeeting platform. We'll outline the project purpose and background, and then Bobby's going to deliver a presentation that touches on a number of different items related to the rural zoning bylaw review. And then after the presentation, we'll conclude with an open question and answer period with the project team. So during this session, you'll see on the top right-hand corner, there's a chat feature, and please feel free to use that to type in your intention to speak or a question or comment that you might have in that chat box throughout the session. And then at the end of the session, your question will be ordered in the answer that they received. We'll also be happy to, you'll be able to unmute your microphone and ask your question, and we can go from there. Just a reminder that, due to the COVID-19 and the evolving public health guidelines and restrictions on limited gatherings to maintain physical distancing, this meeting is being held virtually, and tonight's meeting is being recorded and will be shared on the township's website at a later date for those who are unable to attend this evening. So, Bobby, could you go to the next slide, please? So just wanted to provide an overview who's listening and who's here this evening from the project team. So I'll allow everyone to introduce themselves, but I'd like to also introduce Bobby Gauthier from WSP, who's the consulting firm that's working on this project, and Kristen Harrison, who's the township's project manager. I'll pass the microphone off to Kristen now, just to introduce the mayor and councillors who have been able to join us this evening and share some opening remarks.
Thank you, Matt, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to participate in our virtual open house. We appreciate your time, so thank you for giving some of that to us. And yes, as Matt had indicated, we have on the call this evening, we have Mayor Pellegrini, as well as Councillor Schaefer and Councillor Eek. And from township staff, we have myself, I'm Kristen Harrison, a policy planner with King. As well, I see that we have Aloma Dreyer and Colin Pang, who are both planners with the township. And again, thank you for your time this evening, and I'll pass it back over to Matt. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. And before I turn it over to Bobby for the presentation, I'd like to just go over again some housekeeping items on the GoToMeeting platform. Again, the meeting is being recorded, and we ask that you remain muted during the session until the Q&A period, when we'll call on each individual who wishes to ask a question or share a comment. And please feel free to use the chat function, so it's that bubble on the top right corner that you can see on the slide, to share any questions, thoughts, or ideas. And we'll get to those in the order they're received at the end of the session. And just make sure when you are using the chat box that you select the everyone setting so that everyone can see your question, including myself, so that we can make sure that gets on the queue for questions. So now I'll pass the presentation over to Bobby, my colleague from WSP, and then we'll come back together for the open Q&A session. So Bobby, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks so much, Matt, for that great introduction. Really happy to be here this evening with residents from the township. I've been doing work in King Township for probably 5 or 6 years now, and happy to be continuing to work with the township and advance, I think, what we can describe as sort of the next phase of the township zoning bylaw review. So you may know that the township had recently completed zoning bylaws for the 3 villages of King. And now the township is shifting over to preparing a new zoning bylaw for the rural areas as well as the hamlet areas of the township. So Matt mentioned in his introductory remarks that this is our first open house. It's our first formal launch of this project. And we're very pleased to be here to be introducing the project to you and explaining why it's important and the kinds of things that we're planning to be doing in this project. We will be having a couple of other public open houses just in the next week or so. We've got another one on Thursday and another one on Wednesday. The same content is being presented at all open houses as the notice indicated, so there isn't really a need to attend all, but you're certainly welcome to if you want to participate in all 3 discussions, more than welcome. The purpose of the project fundamentally is to produce a brand new zoning bylaw for the rural, the agricultural, and the hamlet areas of the township. Okay, so we'll be reviewing all of that existing zoning, updating it, modernizing it, and in particular, we'll be looking to implement recent planning policy, including the township's new official plan. And I'll talk a lot more about some of the objectives and the reasons for undertaking this project as we kind of move forward. But overall, that's really the intent of the project, to replace the existing zoning within the rural areas with a brand new bylaw. So in terms of our study area for the project, I'd like to go over that pretty clearly because it is a pretty clearly defined study area. Our study area excludes the villages of Schaumburg, Nobleton, and King City. These 3 villages are already subject to relatively recent zoning bylaws, so they're not being reviewed through this process. Rather, our process focuses on the areas that you see kind of shaded in yellow on the map. So we'll be addressing, the really diverse communities, the hamlets, as well as the rural and the agricultural areas, and even all the naturally significant areas throughout the entire township. So it is a very large study area encompassing a big chunk of the township. So in terms of the status of the current zoning bylaw, so as I've mentioned, the township's recently passed new zoning bylaws in each of the 3 villages. So the Nobleton Urban Area Zoning Bylaw 2016-71 was completed in 2016. And that bylaw only applies to what we call the Nobleton urban area, kind of that existing built up area where development is pretty imminent and expected to continue in the foreseeable future. The lands just outside of that, sort of the reserve area, the lands between that urban area and the broader village boundary is part of our settlement area, or is part of our study area rather. So if you do own land in that area, it is part of the zoning review process. And then as I've mentioned, King City Schaumburg was subject to a zoning bylaw process as well. There's a new bylaw, 2017-66, and so now we're embarking upon, I guess what you could call as the last phase of the township's significant effort to modernize its zoning. So what is a zoning bylaw? I can certainly appreciate there's probably a pretty wide range of different people on the call. So at a really high level, a zoning bylaw is a pretty fundamental and important planning document that the township administers. It is a legal document. It's very detailed, and you'll find that it regulates principally the use of land and buildings. So if you want to know what you can do on your property, odds are you'll probably look to the zoning bylaw as your first step. The zoning bylaw will tell you, as of right, what can you do on your property? Can you build a single attached dwelling? Can you build a farm implement dealer? What kinds of things are you allowed to put on your property? It'll regulate the size of lots, the width of the lot, which we call the frontage. You can regulate the depth of the lot and the lot area. We also regulate the character, the location, and the height of buildings and structures with a zoning bylaw. You've probably heard the term setbacks or lot coverage. These are the kinds of things that are regulated in a zoning bylaw. So suffice it to say, it's a very detailed bylaw. Usually when you're using a zoning bylaw, the first thing you'll do is you'll flip to the back and you'll check to see what your property is zoned. You'll look at the maps. There's always a map that goes along with a comprehensive zoning bylaw. And that's how zoning bylaws work. They divide the community into different zones, and each zone contains a set of provisions and a set of permitted uses. So finding out what zone you're in is usually the first step to understanding what regulations apply to your property. And the township's authority to pass zoning bylaws falls under the Planning Act. So the province has granted the township this authority, but zoning bylaws are administered and enforced, enforced by the township. It's not a York Region bylaw or a provincial law, and the zoning bylaw isn't even subject to regional or provincial approval. It's a township bylaw. So what does the zoning look like throughout the rural area of King Township? So the map that you see on the slide here, it's a nice colorful map trying to categorize all the different zone categories that you see. And we based this off of GIS data. If you were to look at the zone map that's appended to the current text, it doesn't exactly look like this because we're developing a new map, we're developing a new bylaw. But right now we've developed this zoning map based on our GIS data, or Geographic Information Systems data. And what we found is amongst all the different zones, in large part, if you look at the map, you can see very clearly a big chunk of the township is zoned within various acreages and marine categories. A significant portion of the township is zoned within various rural and agricultural zones. And then you do find some instances of some other zones throughout the rural area, but mainly in the hamlets. There's a few instances of properties zoned for industrial uses, a few instances of properties zoned for institutional and other uses. But in large part, I think it's fair to say the majority of the existing zoning is rural and a little bit of residential, as well as these specialized acreages and marine zones. And then looking at the zoning in the hamlets, just to zoom in a little bit on that, the zoning in large part, I think it's fair to characterize it as being principally hamlet residential, right? So many of these different neighborhoods are zoned hamlet. And part of the scope of this project is understanding, does the hamlet residential zone, does the HR zone that you see applied through all these neighborhoods, does it work? Is it properly reflecting the character of these different neighborhoods? Is it reflecting the different public interests of the township? Or is there a need to update the HR zone? Is it out of date for various reasons? So that's something we'll be able to look at. But in large part, you see the zoning in the hamlets is HR. And then again, you do see some instances of zoning like industrial zoning and commercial zoning on certain properties where they've achieved or obtained that zoning through some prior process. And looking at the other four hamlets on this slide, sort of the same thing, except Kettleby, Snowball, Graham Side Road seem to be more instances of RU zoning as opposed to the HR zone. So it kind of begs the question, well, why isn't it zoned HR? Does the HR zone, would it work better than the current zoning that's there now? Does the current zoning reflect, some of the unique characteristics of these communities? And maybe that's why it's applied. So we'll certainly be looking at the zoning throughout all the hamlets through this process. So what is the review process and what is the timing for it? So we're looking at basically a three-phase process, which is very similar to the process that was undertaken for the zoning bylaw updates in the three villages. So we're currently in phase one. As I mentioned, we're just kicking off the project. This is our first meeting, and we're here to essentially introduce our discussion paper. So that'll be sort of the focus of the latter half of the presentation. The phase has really been ongoing since about spring of this year, looking to conclude by the end of this year or early next year. Initially in the spring, we had actually been planning to have in-person open houses, perfectly timed. I think we were looking at April or early May or something like that, and we were looking to get that together in March, and then things went sideways, and the township became so busy adapting to COVID and all of these other things that we got to talking, and obviously COVID's not going away overnight, so we decided it makes sense. Let's keep charging through. Let's proceed. Let's host some virtual open houses, start to get some input and feel out the community, and kind of go from there. So that's where we're at today. We're here to kick off the consultation. We wanted to do this all the way back in the spring, but here we are today. So our objective for this meeting and the following two meetings in the next few weeks is to obtain your comments on the discussion paper. And on the basis of those comments, we'll finalize the discussion paper and present that to council. That will be sort of the culmination and the conclusion of phase 1 is the presentation of the discussion paper to council. I don't think that's not going to happen in 2020. I'm thinking probably something like March of next year, once we've had some sufficient time for people to review the materials and provide some input. And then we'll be looking to present this to council, like I said, in the spring. Once we get through this phase and start to confirm the directions and the discussion paper, we'll be embarking on writing the first draft of the rural zoning bylaw. And we're actually going to be starting some preliminary internal tasks on that over the coming months. And the intent is to release the first draft zoning bylaw in about June of next year. And just like with this meeting, we'll be having a series of open houses. We'll be doing updates to the project website and providing as many opportunities as we can for consultation. I don't exactly know what consultation is going to look like in June of 2021 or where COVID is at and all these other things, but I think it's fair to say that I think we can proceed, and I think we'll have lots of different options available to us to consult the community. And then after we received some input on the draft zoning bylaw, we'd be moving into phase 3, which is the finalization of the zoning bylaw. So we'll be addressing all of the comments that we receive, hosting a statutory public meeting, again, updating the website, and then presenting the bylaw for council's consideration to adopt. And we'd be looking to do that in about a year from now, so in approximately fall of next year. I would really consider the timeline to be kind of tentative because we have to see how the consultation kind of plays out, but obviously we also don't want the project to drag on too long. We want to get it done. I know the township is quite eager to have new modern zoning in place in the rural areas. So, but I think more to come. I think this will evolve a little bit as we see how consultation plays out. We start to get input from the community, and we'll be sure to update the website with any timeline adjustments or any consultation program adjustments. So why is the township updating all of the zoning in the rural areas? What's wrong with it? Number one is we need to make sure that the zoning in the rural areas conforms to the township's new official plan. And you may be aware that the township completed its official plan review process, submitted that for approval by the region. The region's approved it. There's appeals that are sort of ongoing, and we can chat about that in the discussion later. But suffice it to say, we have a legislated requirement. In order to meet the requirements of the Planning Act, the zoning has to be reviewed and updated to fit within the requirements of the official plan. And I'll talk about that just in a couple of slides a little bit more. I think it's also an opportunity to simply modernize and improve the zoning bylaw. It's an older zoning bylaw. It dates back to the 1970s. It's been amended many times. And I think there's a lot of benefit to producing a new zoning bylaw from the perspective of efficiency, the amount of time staff spend administering the bylaw and talking with people at the counter with zoning inquiries. Having a new zoning bylaw is very much an opportunity to improve that customer service function. People will be able to check the zoning for themselves, and a lot of people like to do that. It's also, I think, an opportunity to reflect, trends and best practice, modern development practice, modern farming practice. Farming's changed. Farming's always evolving, and it certainly has changed in the last 50 years. And so, to what extent do we need to be updating the zoning requirements for agricultural uses and associated uses? And I'll be talking about that a bit more in the presentation as well. So really briefly on the official plan. So some people on the call may not have heard of the official plan. You may not be aware of what that document is, but like the zoning bylaw, the official plan is another really important planning document that the township administers. It's the document that sets out policy guidance whenever council makes a decision on a zoning application, on any kind of development matter. The official plan at a high level is a document that sets out a strategy for managing growth, and it sets out kind of high level requirements for permitted uses and lot and building requirements. The relationship between the official plan and the zoning bylaw is to translate those high level statements into detailed regulations. So the official plan might broadly say something like, we encourage on-farm diversified uses in this area. But it's the zoning bylaw's job to turn that broad policy statement into specific permissions for specific lands and specific regulations to go along with that. So that's kind of the relationship. Fundamentally though, the new zoning bylaw cannot be more permissive than the official plan. So if the official plan is clearly prohibiting something in an area, the zoning bylaw also cannot permit that. Now, having said that, of course, if a use is existing and was legally established, it can continue to be used as such. So that's kind of the relationship between those documents. It's a very key objective for us to make sure that the zoning bylaw is meeting the requirements of the official plan. This is sort of the second half of the presentation. So far I've been talking a lot about, the broad purpose of the project, the timing, some of the objectives at a high level. I'd like to spend the next half of the presentation, about 15 minutes or so, and walk through some of the key issues in our draft discussion paper. So we've completed a draft discussion paper and we've posted it on speaking.king.ca, and we're very much looking forward to receiving input and comments on this document. The discussion paper is a report that I think serves as a beacon for us on the zoning bylaw review. It's a document that sets a foundation for how we're going to write the zoning bylaw. It's not tremendously detailed. You won't find specific, recommended regulations, but you'll find a general sense of the directions that we need to go in, at least on a preliminary basis. So we're hoping that people can have a look at that document and offer some comments. It's a great document also just for general orientation purposes. If you want to know a little bit about what zoning is and what the official plan is and the relationship of those documents, I think it's a good place to start for that. But the key part of the discussion paper is section 6. Section 6 goes over 14 key issues, and my objective is to walk through each of those in about a minute each, no more than a minute each. So I just want to touch on them, offer a bit of context, a bit of thinking, and then I'm kind of hoping that when we get to the discussion, maybe people have some comments or some thoughts on some of these issues and can share some knowledge. So the first issue, it's kind of a question, is how should we package up the new rural zoning bylaw? And I think fundamentally there are basically two options. We can keep a separate rural zoning bylaw and leave the village zoning bylaws as they are, or we do have the opportunity to merge all of the township's bylaws into one and create a township-wide consolidated bylaw in this process. Suffice it to say, I think that there's pros and cons to both. In my experience working in the township, I think that there's, desire to see things, kind of distinct when they relate to a certain area or a certain set of characteristics. So I think our preliminary thought is to probably keep it separate. I think also the rural zoning bylaw is going to be pretty distinct from the urban zoning bylaws. The urban zoning bylaws deal with, a bunch of matters that really aren't relevant to the rural area and vice versa. Not to say that there wouldn't be overlap, there certainly would be, but I think if the township wants to keep them separate, I think that that's certainly supportable, and I think that there's some benefits to it. So that's the first issue. The second issue really quickly is the Oak Ridges Marine Conservation Plan implementation. When I showed you the slide earlier showing the existing zoning in the township, and you saw that blue or the green kind of in the middle, that's the Oak Ridges Marine area. The Oak Ridges Marine area is subject to a provincial plan, the Oak Ridges Marine Conservation Plan, that sets out some pretty prescriptive requirements around permitted uses, the need for site plan control, limitations on certain kinds of development. And suffice it to say, I think through this process, we need to make sure that the rural zoning bylaw is consistent with that Oak Ridges Marine Conservation Plan. Now, that's not starting from scratch. The township's largely completed that exercise recently, but with the more recent 2017 version of the Oak Ridges Marine Plan, we have to make sure that we're still consistent with it, because I know the province did make some updates to that plan. So that's one of our tasks. The third issue that we want to have a look at, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier when I was looking at the existing zoning in the hamlets. We have an opportunity in this process, to review and confirm that the zoning that you see in the hamlets is in fact working well. Is this HR zoning appropriate to conserve the character of these neighborhoods? What are some of the challenges with that? Does it make sense to have one HR zone applied amongst all these different hamlets? Or does that need to get broken down a little bit to reflect some of the unique characteristics of each hamlet? I think as part of this process too, we need to be thinking about official plan conformity. So there are some instances of industrial uses and commercial uses. We need to be looking at the zoning to confirm that still meets the intent of the official plan. And if it doesn't, to look at some provisions to help with land use compatibility. So that's another key aspect of this project. The fourth issue, secondary residential units. Additional residential units, there's all kinds of different terms for this. But recently the Planning Act has been amended and the official plan updated to implement this. The province and the township encourages and supports the creation of accessory dwelling units. So what I'm talking about are basement apartments, but it could also be a unit in a detached structure on the same lot as well. Secondary residential units broadly permitted through the township, permitted in certain areas of the Oak Ridges Marine Plan. Again, we'll have to make sure that we're being consistent with that plan and not being overly permissive. I think suffice it to say that there's a need to update the current zoning bylaw. It's not quite up to speed with some of the more recent policy on this topic. And so I think we'll be looking to establish appropriate permissions in accordance with the policy, as well as proper zoning provisions, setbacks and requirements to make sure that any second units that do go in are appropriate and not impactful to the character of the community. So the fifth key issue we've identified is looking at the zoning in the Holland Marsh specialty crop area. So the specialty crop area, the Holland Marsh at the north end of the township, it has particular policy status. It's strongly protected for agricultural purposes because it has highly productive soils. And I think through this process, what we want to be doing is reviewing the zoning and understanding, does the zoning still work? Does the zoning make sense for the marsh and the specific challenges and issues that you see in the marsh? In particular, relatively smaller farm sizes. The fact that the marsh consists principally of flood-prone lands. Are there things that we need to be doing in the zoning bylaw to help address some of these unique considerations in this area? The sixth key issue, small farm holdings, kind of along the same lines. So small farm holdings are essentially any farm that was created at some point in the past, but probably doesn't meet the requirements for minimum lot size in the official plan, which off the top of my head, I think it's 10 hectares if I'm not mistaken. But, so we're talking about smaller farms. And while I don't think the official plan or provincial policy is, terribly supportive of creating smaller farms and kind of cutting up farms, I think that there is an opportunity for the rural zoning bylaw to recognize existing undersized farms and to set out appropriate provisions to address their particular needs and considerations, right? When you're on a smaller farm, are the setback requirements in the normal rural zone too difficult to achieve? What are some of the constraints and opportunities for developing small farms? So I think we'd be looking to update the zoning for that, and we can consider creating a special zone for it. The seventh issue, agriculture-related uses. So agriculture-related uses are uses that are kind of devoted to serving a broader farming community. So that might be a grain drying operation, a big farmer's market. Even an example I read was a winery could be an agriculture-related use if it's taking grapes from many different locations as opposed to from one farm, right? So generally speaking, the official plan contemplates agriculture-related uses because they're needed to support the farming community. But there are some requirements, and the township needs to be sure that it's assessing these applications to meet provincial policy and to meet the requirements of the official plan. So typically, an agriculture-related use has to go through a site-specific zoning amendment. That's the usual case. However, having said that, there is an opportunity in this process to create a zone for agriculture-related uses, or some rural industrial or rural commercial zone, and we can introduce a framework of provisions to regulate uses that could be permitted in that zone, recognizing that zone may be applied only through site-specific rezoning applications moving forward. The 8th issue, on-farm diversified uses, a little bit different from agriculture-related uses. So an on-farm diversified use, principally refers to an accessory use on a farm. It's secondary to the farm use, and it's usually there to support, the economic viability of the farm, or generally the kinds of operations that are required for the farm. So on-farm diversified uses could include things like home occupations, agritourism uses, value-added uses, a wide range of different processing uses, turning the produce grown on the farm into a different product. That can be an on-farm diversified use. The official plan generally permits on-farm diversified uses pretty broadly, and I actually think we have an opportunity in this process to not only set requirements for them, but to actually permit them, to set out a framework where they're permitted as of right, along with different requirements to go along with that. So typically an on-farm diversified use could be permitted without a site-specific zoning application, and we want to create the framework where that can occur, where that's appropriate. The 9th issue, bed and breakfasts and short-term accommodations. So I think sites like Airbnb and Booking.com have kind of brought to light this kind of desire to see accommodation uses more broadly, and it's created this opportunity for people to either rent out part of their house, like a second unit, or to rent out an entire house to people who book on the site. I think short-term accommodations, there may be some benefits to them. I think in one sense, they can be defined as a bed and breakfast, and they can maybe support an agricultural use. But in another sense, I think short-term accommodations can be a little risky and impactful. I'm sure people have read stories and news stories all the time about people, renting a house or buying a house for the purposes of listing it on Airbnb and generating, profit and often having some impacts to neighbors. So I think we need to find the proper balance between those things in order to create a framework to move forward. And zoning, I think zoning is key for this. Zoning is what will establish the permissions for short-term accommodations, so it really is the most important implementation tool here. And the township could also consider a complementary licensing or similar registration system to go along with that if it wanted to regulate short-term accommodations in more detail. So key issue number 10, major recreational uses. So things like golf courses, serviced playing fields, campgrounds, ski hills, these kinds of land-intensive uses that do get located in the rural area. Generally speaking, the official plan and the Oak Ridges Marine Plan is pretty restrictive around the establishment of these new uses. I think typically they would have to go through an official plan amendment process to establish a new one. So I don't see the rural zoning bylaw as expanding permissions on this use where they didn't exist before. Certainly, I think we'd want to recognize the ones that are there now. But I do think this is an opportunity for the zoning bylaw to set out some minimum standards for any new proposed major recreational uses. So we can create a zone for future golf courses, and we can set requirements and provisions for them in the bylaw. I like to think of a brand new zoning bylaw as an opportunity for the township to kind of set out its expectations up front. If there wasn't a golf course zone, for example, the township standards wouldn't be clear to an applicant. So I think having a zone and reviewing these standards just gives that opportunity for the township to to set out some expectations up front, even before they get a development application. Source water protection is key issue number 11. So, you may be familiar with some of the legislation, the Clean Water Act and the source protection plans produced under that act, but suffice it to say, it's the intent of the province to, protect our drinking water. And certainly there are a few wellheads that draw water in the township. And under the Clean Water Act, certain uses, certain activities are prohibited within various distances from the wellhead. And our intent would be to implement those restrictions directly in the zoning bylaw. Those are provincial requirements. It's a provincially approved plan. It was also something that was done within the 3 villages, so this wouldn't be new to the township. We'd just be expanding it and making it consistent across the township. Number 12, natural heritage and hazards. I think suffice it to say, the township, it has extensive natural heritage areas, like absolutely straight through the township. It encompasses a big percentage of the land mass in the township. And I do think the rural zoning bylaw plays a role in supporting the official plan's vision and policies for conserving the environment. So certainly at a minimum, we'll want to establish a proper environmental protection zone. And I also think it's an opportunity in this process to review where that zone is applied. Is there better mapping? Is there better information that we can use to update that zoning? Normally you'd update environmental protection zoning through a development application process, but if there is good data that we can use to update floodplain information and that sort of thing, I think we should use that and leverage it to make the bylaw just that much more up to date. Number 13, sustainability and climate change. I think a zoning bylaw has a role in terms of contributing to mitigation of climate change impact or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. A few ideas that we have. One, we could consider things like requirements for pervious surfaces. So I think most people would be familiar with the standard zoning requirement of a minimum lot coverage or a maximum lot coverage. You can cover 50% of your lot with buildings. But in some more modern zoning bylaws, you can also introduce a requirement to say, a minimum 20% of your lot shall be a pervious surface, which means it shall allow the infiltration of rainwater and stormwater. So that's something we could consider. Probably more relevant in the hamlets than in the agricultural areas, but I think that's something that's on our radar. And another potential opportunity for the rural zoning bylaw, I guess, in a way to contribute to these items is supporting or encouraging local food access. I think by expanding and reviewing permissions for on-farm diversified uses, things like allowing produce stands and farmers markets, I think we can help to support the creation of a much more robust local food network, which is something that the official plan strongly encourages. And then, like I said earlier, I think we have an opportunity. We can look at the floodplain zoning and the different provisions that go along with that through this process. So that's sort of another kind of linkage between the zoning bylaw and climate change. And finally, issue number 14, cannabis production uses. So I think people are probably aware, there's been significant changes to federal and provincial legislation on cannabis, including the legalization of cannabis for recreational purposes and a very detailed legal framework for licensing producers of cannabis. Now, the township was very proactive, and they went ahead and completed a cannabis zoning amendment in 2018. In particular, I think in response to cannabis production for medical purposes, right? But since then, the legislation's evolved, and I think also, the knowledge on this topic has evolved. And so we're looking to, carry forward this amendment that the township did, but also to update it and to reflect these changes to federal legislation. So what kinds of requirements should the zoning bylaw have to regulate cannabis production? Should we have minimum setback requirements? Should we have, special minimum lot area? All these kinds of things we can certainly consider and build on all the work that the township did previously. All right. So there we go. Those are the 4 of the 14 key issues that you'll find in section 6 of the discussion paper. So we're hoping that everyone can have a look at that. I appreciate that as an absolute ton of information, and it's a lot to wrap your head around. I certainly think that different people will probably have different interests, and we'd absolutely welcome your comments and your thoughts and your questions. So in terms of moving forward, keep in touch. We're certainly asking people to, sign up if you'd like to, and keep checking the website, because the website will be updated on a regular basis, and it will always be posting new information just as soon as it's made available. In terms of our next steps on the project, so we'll be looking to really start work on the first draft rural zoning bylaw. We'll start some internal technical work to move things forward, but really we need to get input on this discussion paper in order to finalize the directions. We'll be looking, like I said, probably in about February to present the discussion paper in a final state or a final draft state to council for consideration. We're also looking at the potential to have workshops early in the new year. So if there is, a lot of interest in certain topics, like maybe on-farm diversified uses, I'm not sure what part of the presentation made people's eyebrows go up. That's the one negative thing of being online, is I can't necessarily see everybody in the room. But I'm certain that there are some topics in the presentation that people have thoughts on, and we certainly invite those thoughts. So we're hoping to get input into the discussion paper, mid-February at the absolute latest. But like I said, we're looking to get this to council for consideration by February. So ideally comments by about mid-January, if at all possible. That would be sort of our ask. And then, like I said, we'll be looking to release the first draft zoning bylaw in June. So stay tuned for that as well. Before I turn it over to Matt to take over the Q&A, what I'd like to do is just take a couple of minutes and open up the website. I'd like to show some of the features on the website so people are familiar with them. So if you'll bear with me for just one moment, I will attempt to switch my screens. So you should be able to see that. Good, perfect. So if you go to speaking.king.ca, if you haven't been here before, I think it's an excellent landing page. It shows you all of the different projects that the town has ongoing. These little convenient progress bars kind of in the corner, which I like. The rural zoning bylaw review you'll find at the moment in the top right, and just click on that. And this is our landing page. This is our central place for posting all the information on the project. You can certainly share with social media. There's some general orientation context here that you'll see. At the top right, I'll stop scrolling so much. At the top right, you'll see a little box to enter your email address if you want to be added to the circulation list. There's an FAQ section. I won't click on all these links, but there's an FAQ just with answers to the kinds of questions that a lot of people might have. Important links on the side is also notable, because these are some links to where you'll find existing zoning information. So the township's existing zoning bylaws, and there's also an interactive map where you can explore the zoning. So I won't open that now, but it certainly is a good tool if you want to have a look at that. And here's a link to the official plan page as well, just because this is so intrinsically linked to the zoning review. Project timeline on the side, and then down at the bottom right, you'll find links to all the documents. This is the link to the discussion paper. So if you'd like to have a look at that, that would be great. Kristen's contact information at the far bottom right. And then there are, and I'll just kind of turn my attention to sort of the middle of the page, there are a few places where people can actually interact. So the news feed is where we'll post, almost like blog style updates once in a while as the project moves forward. The map, if you click on map, you will get an interactive map pop up. I'm going to open it up. If you just click on it, the same instructions kind of appear over here. So we've kind of created this interactive map, and we're hoping what people will do is just drop pins to offer comments. Again, I think our emphasis is on offering as many opportunities as possible for people to get involved. And the purpose of the interactive map is, really to just seek comments from people. And we're kind of asking for two kinds of pins. So if you go on the left, you'll see that little plus to add a pin. I'd have to sign in to be able to do it, but once you've signed in and you've registered, you can certainly do that. And there's two kinds of pins. There's a green pin and a blue pin. For the green pin, what the ask is and what we're hoping people can share with us is your knowledge about the rural areas of the township. Do you have a farm? Do you like, what are you doing on your farm? What kinds of crops are you growing? Do you have any on-farm diversified uses on your property that you'd like us to know about? Part of what I'm doing is I'd like to kind of develop a deep understanding and a knowledge of the kinds of agricultural activities that are occurring in the township. And I'm really hoping the residents and the farmers in the community can help me out with that. So I think this would be quite beneficial if people really do utilize it, for sure. And then the blue pin is just any other comment. If you want to just make a note about the zoning, you feel like there's an error in the zoning for your property or something of that nature, drop a blue pin and add a comment. So that's the interactive map. There's also a Q&A feature, which I hope people will also utilize. And you can simply just post a question. And myself and Kristen will be contributing to responses to all the questions that are posted here. I think this is another great way to get involved. And then finally, the final tab here is a survey. I won't click on it, but when you click on it, again, it'll ask you to sign in and register. And it's just a quick survey. It's almost like a questionnaire because it is, we're asking some pretty broad questions, and we're just looking for general feedback as to the kinds of issues that we should address in this process. So I think that's it for me, Matt. Appreciate everybody being here and for listening to my lengthy presentation. And I'm looking forward to participating in the discussion. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Bobby. And if you don't mind, maybe just pulling up the presentation again when you get the opportunity. So thanks to everyone who's been able to put their question in the chat box. We do have a few questions in the queue, so we'll definitely jump right into those. Could you do the next slide, Bobby? Okay, there were, is there a, sorry, could you go to the next one? Okay, there was supposed to be another slide in there that had just sort of a repeat of some of the ground rules, but again, everyone is still muted, and I'll definitely call on everyone who's in the queue, and at that time, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question or pose your comment, and feel free to just repeat either what's in the chat box, or you can ask me to, and I'm happy to speak to that. Once you do that, I'll pass the question off to Bobby or to Kristen to answer. And just because we do have a little bit of a larger group today, we're hoping everyone can cap their time to about 3 minutes to share your comments or questions. And once you've had everyone had the chance to ask their question or share their comment, we'll certainly can go back around through the group and take a second round of questions as time permits. If you'd like to follow up with the project team, Bobby did a fantastic job walking through the speaking page. Or if you'd like to speak one-on-one, feel free to follow up with Kristen at the township, and her contact information is on the project website. And as Bobby said, we want to maintain this conversation, and your input is vital into this project. So the first question, this is sort of perhaps to the earlier conversations about the zoning. Angela asked, perhaps, what is HR zoning is the question. Bobby, I'll perhaps pass that to you, and Kristen, if you'd like to jump in.
For sure, yeah. So the HR zone is, as I noted in the presentation, the principal zone category that you see applied to many of the neighborhoods in the hamlets. So the HR zone is, if you're not too familiar with the zoning bylaw, it's a set of provisions and permitted uses. I don't have the HR zone in front of me, but I would imagine it's kind of more of a rural character. I think what kind of stood out to me was the fact that you see the HR zone applied pretty broadly across, many of the hamlets, not all of the hamlets, but many of them. And it seems to be applied to a whole bunch of different neighborhoods as well. And so I'm kind of wondering to myself, is this one size fits all zone? Is it appropriate? Does it work? Do the standards work? Do they appropriately reflect the character of these different neighborhoods? So we're hoping through this process to have a look at the HR zone, confirm that it is kind of meeting these different policy requirements. I mean, it is an objective of the official plan to maintain the character of neighborhoods, right? So that's kind of our driver here. So we'll be looking at that zoning and updating it to address those official plan requirements. So I hope that answered the question, but I'm happy to take a follow-up.
Yeah, Angela, feel free to unmute yourself and chime in on that question.
And of course, we're all, oh, sorry, go ahead, Angela.
So thanks. It was a little bit more than what I was looking for. I actually wanted to know, what does H and what does R stand for?
Hamlet Residential.
Hamlet Residential. Okay, I would have get. Okay, great. All right, thanks.
I overthought your question.
No. That was additional information that I probably would have asked as a follow-on. So thanks.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thanks, Angela. Tom, would you perhaps want to unmute yourself and ask your first question about the Oak Ridges Moraine and the Greenbelt?
Thank you, Matt. Tom Butt here. The question deals with selected areas identified across many of the planning documents, the Oak Ridges Moraine, the Greenbelt, the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan. And they're referred, there's 3 distinct areas that I'm aware of, and I think they have their own definition at a provincial level, and those are the ANSI's, areas of natural and scientific interest, wetlands, and woodlands. Each of those has, I understand, are protected areas. One of your slides referred to that, I think, under the Oak Ridges Moraine banner. And I just was hoping that you could give a bit more detail as to how protected those areas are and what does protected mean. And starting with, I guess, the ANSIs, are they do they have a higher priority than the woodland protected areas or the wetland protected areas? And again, I'll finish off by, what does protected mean?
Bobby, do you perhaps want to start with that question?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So absolutely, the official plan sets out a framework that, really clearly requires, as you said, the protection of certain features in the township. And that includes, just like you said, things like ANSIs, wetlands, woodlands, and there's a whole host of other features. So the official plan, it approximates these features. I don't know if you're familiar with the official plan, but there are schedules that show, approximately where these features are based on the township's best understanding and knowledge. And usually that just comes from, review of air photography and that sort of thing. So it's not terribly accurate in the official plan. The official plan says, essentially, within those kinds of features, once they're confirmed and they're delineated, development and site alteration is generally not permitted in them. In terms of whether, there's sort of different levels of protection, I don't know that I would characterize it that way. I think what I would say is that there's different policies for each of them. And I think overall the intent of the official plan is to see these features studied in order to assess, first of all, where they are. Usually when there's a development application, if someone wants to do something on their property, they'll come to the township and they may have to submit a wide range of different applications. And part of that is usually the need to produce a natural heritage evaluation. And through that natural heritage evaluation, which is completed by an expert consultant who understands the ecological aspects and all the different provincial requirements, they'll actually go through and they'll study these different features and they'll delineate them like much more specifically. The official plan is only approximating them. They'll delineate them. And in addition to that, the natural heritage evaluation will also set out recommendations for mitigation. It might have requirements for buffers around the feature, and it might say, look, not only should you not have development within this wetland, we also don't want you to have development within 120 meters of the wetland or something like that. So what's really difficult in a zoning bylaw review process is to try to implement all that policy all at once, because usually you know, these features get studied and they get, you know, they get mapped and they get zoned through a development application review process. Our intent in this project is definitely, you know, if any development applications have been completed recently and there's any natural heritage evaluations that have been done recently that we can leverage, we're going to bring that into this project and we're going to update the zoning to reflect all that good information that's out there. But we may be limited, you know, I would imagine there's a big chunk of the township that's just not perfectly well understood when it comes to the natural heritage constraints and features on the property. So in that case, it may be desirable, at least in some areas of the township, for the township to see a study before actually trying to update the zoning for those features. So I hope that helped to answer your question, Tom, but appreciate if you would like a follow-up.
Well, no, right up until the last sentence or two, I wasn't concerned, but I agree with you. I don't, from my limited experience with my property and getting it assessed or evaluated, the accuracy has been suspect, and the negotiations were open, and I was allowed to introduce information, and that was fair. But I guess I would encourage this process to be a bit more specific in its mapping, as you referred to in your presentation, and in the understanding of the linkages between natural areas. I guess they're natural linkages that make the township work or make the rural areas work. Chopping it up or replacing acreages in one location to compensate for acreages that are being developed in another location takes away from the natural flow of the land.
Yeah,
and I think if those guidelines are introduced early, then that the ground rules are understood. I'll give you 5 acres over in on Side Road 8 for 5 acres I can develop over here on Dufferin Street, and everybody's happy. Well, no, that's if we can manage that process early, then we can benefit the community, benefit the township.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I think we'll ponder your comment a bit more, but for sure, to the extent we can, we want to be updating, you know, the zoning for these features. But you know, I think further to your point, one of the challenges that we have is, just like you said, you know, the official plan encourages linkages amongst features, not simply the protection of the features themselves, but the creation of linkages, because that promotes sort of that ecological integrity and the resilience of an overall natural heritage network instead of a single feature, right? And the difficulty in the zoning review process is, you know, to be able to know where those linkages should be and to actually delineate them, you definitely need a specific study to inform what that's going to be. So I kind of expect we'll be a little bit limited in this process in terms of our ability to zone them, but certainly, you know, your points are well taken, and I think to the extent we can, we will want to delineate them for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom. And we'll come back to your second question if you don't mind. We'll definitely have time to come back to that after. But Larry, you did have a question about the cannabis zoning bylaw amendment, and I was wondering if Kristen maybe wanted to take that, if you could share the question with the group.
I'm sorry, do you want me to go through the question?
If you don't mind, or I'm happy to do that for you.
But yeah, I guess my question was, you know, last night we spent several hours with council where council approved some of the amendments to the bylaws that specified more clearly the definitions of medical cannabis growing and so forth, and then where they apply in R1 and R2. And obviously the intent was also to make sure that cannabis growing is prohibited in the marsh because of all the problems that they have brought forward. And I just want to make sure that as we go through this process of zoning and rezoning and changing some of these areas, that we keep that spirit of what was passed last night that says cannabis growing in the Holland Marsh should be prohibited. And in the R1 and industrial zones, they need to follow the requirements that were outlined and laid out in the bylaw that was passed last night. If anything, we should be strengthening those and not weakening them, because this production of cannabis is a cancer that is spreading, and we should keep it away from King, and we should keep it away from most of the area as much as we possibly can.
Thank you, Larry, for your comments. And yes, the intent is to carry forward the provisions that were passed by council just recently, last night, and build upon those. So continuing to look at all the different types of licensing that the federal government provides for, and continue to make sure that our bylaws are up to date and enforceable when it comes to cannabis production.
And when we know, I know that the town, did a great job in passing a bylaw like back in 2018, and just how quickly people figured out loopholes and how to get around them. And because there's so much money involved in this thing, people get very creative on how to, bypass the laws and how to get around the loopholes. So if we leave a little bit of a window, before you know it, they've got a great big double door, opening. So I encourage the project and the teams to, as you said, continue to build on this. Let's not go backwards, but rather let's, continue to enhance the bylaws that we've already put in place.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it will be kind of an iterative process. And as things keep evolving with cannabis production and the different types of licensing that are available out there, then we'll have to keep adapting. And that's part of the reason why we review the bylaw and why we reviewed the bylaw that we did in 2018 just recently. So yeah, we'll continue on that path of continuing to review as we move forward.
Thank you.
Thanks so much to you both. Maury, you had a question. Would you want to run that by the group, or I'm happy to
Sure.
read that out? Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So I live in a rural residential zoning area, and I was happy to hear that one of the things you're looking at is secondary residential units. And I wonder what the possibilities are of looking at minimum lot sizes, which would be even more helpful than that. And I believe where we live now, it's something like 18 acres. And so is that a potential that you're going to look at as well?
Bobby, perhaps I'll pass that to you first.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I certainly think that there's opportunity for us to set a minimum lot area requirement in order to permit a secondary residential unit. I think normally the province generally, pushes for second units to be permitted essentially wherever you have a single attached dwelling. So, that would certainly encompass the RR zone, yeah.
But having a secondary unit on one lot is different than being able to create a second lot that has a residential unit.
That's absolutely right, yeah. So the notion of creating new lots for dwellings, that's something regulated by the official plan. It's quite restricted, and it wouldn't be our intent through the secondary unit provisions to allow for that. When I'm talking about secondary units, I'm definitely talking about basement apartments or like a garden suite or something along those lines.
So not a second house.
Not a second house, and certainly
even
not
if you have
20
lot. Acres of land.
Well, I think
that is not farmland.
Yeah, I think if it sounds like you have some interest in your specific property, and I wonder if maybe we could maybe have an offline conversation to have a look at that specifically.
Sure,
but
I'd love to. Who would I speak to? And
if you want to reach out to Kristen Harrison, I'm not sure if you have that information in front of you.
Yeah, I've got the number.
Perfect. Yeah, I think Kristen would be a good place to start anyway. But generally speaking, when it comes to severances, that's a matter mainly addressed by the official plan, and we won't be looking to update those rules through this process.
So your process doesn't look at lot sizes, or because you just mentioned a while ago that you're looking at potentially smaller farms. So how is that different than this?
Yeah, we certainly can look at the minimum lot area requirements, but we have to operate within what the official plan says, right? The official plan has some pretty clear rules about how big farms and how big new lots are allowed to be. So whatever minimum lot area requirements we have in the bylaw, it's got to be consistent with the official plan. We're not looking to update those rules in the official plan, but we can actually be more restrictive than the official plan if we wanted to be through this process.
Okay.
And maybe, Bobby, if I can just add that in our rural areas, they're protected by the Oak Ridges Marine Conservation Plan as well as the Greenbelt Plan, and lot creation under those provincial plans is quite restrictive. So even if the township wanted to pass policies to allow for lot creation in the rural area, in a lot of instances, it wouldn't be permitted by upper tier policy.
All right, thanks for your response.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Debbie, we'll come to you to your question. Do you want to run that by the group, or would you like me to read that out?
Oh, why don't you go ahead and read it out, Matthew? That's fine. Sure.
So, Bobby, I guess Debbie was just looking for some clarification around wellhead protection, and it just sounds like there's something that needs to be implemented. So is it simply a question of defining the areas, or do you think that the current zones are not adequate?
I think, my expectation out of this is we'll probably do something like what you see in the village zoning bylaws. So if you look at the King City, the Nobleton, Schaumburg bylaws, there's sort of like an overlay schedule that shows the wellhead protection areas, and you see the different times of travel zones, which indicate, how long it takes for water to get into the source water. I think our intent would be to carry forward that kind of an approach. And then you would want to restrict certain uses and activities within those different areas consistent with the Clean Water Act and the Source Protection Plan. I don't think that that's going to be, I'd have to refresh my memory. I don't think it's going to be restrictive on, farm operations or anything like that. I think it's mainly dealing with, certain industrial chemicals and wastewater treatment plants. I mean, to be quite honest, what I've found is that the prohibitions under the source protection plans, they tend to cover uses that aren't permitted in the zone anyway. But I think it's good to be clear and to be consistent with that legislation. So that would be our intent.
I'm seeing a nod, so hopefully that answered your question there, Debbie. We've made it through the first round of questions, and there were a couple follow-ups. So I'll go back to Tom's second question, and this might be something for Kristen to start with, and Bobby to perhaps follow up with. Tom, did you want to share your question just about the employment lands?
Yes, in last night's council meeting, there was a concern during the development charges presentation on the competitiveness of King Township versus local neighbors, Bradford, East and West Gwillimbury, and were the development charges a hindrance. And there was specific reference made to the 400 highway and more importantly, the Highway 9 corridors and the employment lands that could be used in those corridors, developing development charges and competing with neighbors to King Township. So I didn't see in your map, I saw the three settlement areas. Are there employment lands designated on the two corridors, on the 400 corridor and the Highway 9 corridor that reflect last night's discussion?
I can start and see if Kristen would like to jump in. So currently, in the official plan, and unless my memory mistakes me, I don't think that there is an employment land designation or area on the 400 corridor. Highway 11 corridor, I recall from the official plan review, was identified as a sort of a special study area in order to kind of confirm.
11 isn't in the township, is it? The two corridors were the Highway 9 corridor and the Highway the 400.
Oh,
400.
I'm sorry. You said Highway 9. Yeah.
And that's one that's more anxious. I mean, there was that recent recommendation by the York Region Council to bring water into settlement areas through a Big Pipe 2 type process that was negated by the province. And I think in that discussion, there were references to employment lands on the 400 corridor. I think there was a reference to I shouldn't, my memory a little weak here, or even my information may be wrong. 400 and Highway 9 corridor was an example. But last night was definitely the corridors of Highway 9 and the 400 highway.
Yeah, and maybe I can chime in there. So,
are there areas designated? Are there employment lands that were referred to last night? Are they designated? Are they mapped out?
So at this time, there are not employment lands in those areas along the 400 and Highway 9 in King Township. And what I believe what you're referring to, the York Region Council had a report and recommendations that they've moved, and they're asking the province to review whether in strategic locations, whether employment uses could be provided along 400 series highways in all of York Region, so not just specific to King. And that request was made by York Region to the province to look at the provincial plans to allow for those opportunities for employment uses in specific or strategic locations. But there has been no decision from the province in that regard, and there has not been any amendments to our official plan or the region's official plan to allow for that at this time.
Highway 9?
So in terms of this review, we can only implement the official plan. So we can't allow for something that is not permitted in our official plan through the zoning bylaw. So through this zoning bylaw review, all of our uses will have to align with the policies of our official plan, which at this time do not allow for employment uses in those areas, and would require a review of the official plan to allow for any of those uses, as well as changes documents.
That was a mishearing discussion last night. That's I guess I'll have to go back and look at my notes.
Okay, and we can have a discussion offline about this, Tom, if you'd like to follow up with me on that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, everyone. Okay, we do have one last question in the queue, and then again, I'd be happy to open up to anyone else who has a question. And Angela, you just had a question about cannabis growers and compliance to the group, or I can certainly read that out.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, we have bylaws. Bylaws are usually enforced by bylaw officers, but getting involved in enforcing cannabis bylaws or zoning bylaws as they relate to cannabis growers can be a little bit testy. So I'm wondering who would be enforcing bylaws that we're making, and do we therefore have the concurrence of York Regional Police in whatever we come up with, if that makes sense?
I can take that one. Thanks, sure. Angela, for your question. Yeah, so with cannabis, it is often a collaborative effort. So with our bylaw enforcement, as well as York Regional Police, when they're enforcing either the bylaw or the law, the criminal law. So It's a coordinated effort and often involves our fire emergency services and a number of different bodies in order to enforce the law, including the zoning bylaw. And we work I know our bylaw enforcement officers work hand in hand with York Regional Police on a number of different issues throughout the township. Does that answer your question? Kind of?
It does, it does. I mean, I actually have a bit of a personal interest in this. There has been a rumor that we might be getting, well, I don't want to continue the rumor, but there is some concern in my neighborhood. And so I'm welcoming bylaws that are going to be helpful in regulating this potential problem in my neighborhood.
Thanks for that. And feel free to follow up with me after the meeting if you want to give me any more details.
Okay.
Details.
Great. Thanks, everyone. So that does bring us to the end of the questions and the comments that were left in the chat box. Does anyone have any final questions or comments? I see a hand raised. Please feel free to unmute yourself.
There we go. They move around all the time. Hi there. Okay, so given that there's so many opportunities for members of council to respond, doing surveys and submitting comments and stuff, I know with our engineering and public works department, they've been undertaking with the transportation master plan and the there's so many that we've got on the go, I forget. But anyway, we've had one-on-one with the staff, and they've booked a little appointment and spoken with each member of council individually. Is that, I love the process, because then we can really have a fulsome discussion. So like one-on-one, are you going to be doing that, or just leave it to, you know what, read the documents, do the survey, and send your comments? Your answer, please.
So I'm personally a big fan of one-on-one, and I'd like to do some of that. I think the more of that we can get, the better. I really want to dig into people's knowledge in the township, and certainly Councillor Eek, I know that you've got a lot of knowledge that you can share. You know, we're trying to build our understanding of the agricultural community and agricultural uses and farm practices in the township, and also trends in farming, and evaluating whether the zoning is working. So I'm very happy to have one-on-one conversations. I think we can certainly make that work. I'd like to be as proactive as possible in order to get ahead of those things. Absolutely.
Awesome, Bobby. I'm looking forward to our conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Any other, Mr. Mayor, I see a hand.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank both you two and Kristen. Bobby, it's great working with you again. It's nice you've got a good foundation, and with Kristen, I expect great things, because you guys have already been down this road enough times. I've asked about this a couple times, and I'll put one last little request. A planning 101 just on the front page, so that people understand the difference. It was great you did it in your presentation between an official plan and zoning, but also the different levels, like that our official plan gets approved by York Region, which then goes to the province, and the hierarchy, and how a lot of the policies are dictated by the province and the provincial planning process. One of the gentlemen was talking about severances and whether we permit severances. And a lot of people think it's us saying no. And it's like, no, the province is saying no. And it's a hard no. So no matter what we put in writing, and I know Kristen mentioned that, it's not going to happen. We have to go through a certain hierarchy, but just simple. So when people look at it high level, because even cannabis, you know, we dealt with it last night as well. It's not just the rural area. Our bylaw is across all of King for when we put some of these bylaws in. So I want some people to understand, just listening to some of the questions, a simple flow chart or something about how planning happens. Everybody thinks as soon as someone puts an application in that the township is out there soliciting these applications. And I tell people, no, you're allowed to put in any application you ever want. It's up to us to tell you or to guide you and say, that's not really something that's going to happen with the zoning within what you want to do. So please withdraw it. But if you want to spend the money and go through the process, you're more than welcome, but you're not going to get anywhere. So just my comments, but thank you. I look forward to this, and I hope, like you said, we can move through it fairly quickly now that we've kicked off the process.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and very happy to take that away, and we'll discuss opportunities for sort of like a planning 101 kind of document for the website with the township. It's a great idea.
Okay. Any other questions or comments or physical raised hands?
If I could add something quickly, Matt, to Councillor Eek's point about meeting one-on-one. I'm also, you know, we're also open to meeting one-on-one with residents and having those kinds of discussions, because, you know, in our original work plan, we tabled all these ideas for in-person events, and we can't do them. So, you know, like I said in the presentation, we're thinking about workshops early in the new year. You know, and perhaps instead of workshops, it's more one-on-one discussions. But I think suffice it to say, we're open and we're nimble to respond to how people want to be engaged.
Thanks, Bobby, and that's a good point. Just a reminder to the survey, if you do have the opportunity to fill out the survey, we'd love there's a question there about how you'd like to be engaged through this process. So do feel free to visit that. Did I see another thumbs up or a hand, or there's just thumbs up? Okay, thumbs up, great. Not seeing any other hands raised. We'll conclude the meeting. Bobby, Kristen, and I will stay on for until 8 o'clock. So if you did want to maybe ask a question or chat a bit further, happy to do